3, 2, 1. Good afternoon. I'm Dryden Pence, and it's July the 1st, 2022, about 2:15 in the afternoon. There's a lot going on, and a lot has gone on, and my job is to kind of give you the big so what here. What does it all mean? The first half of the year in the markets has been pretty brutal. As a matter of fact, we've just gone through the worst first half of the year since 1970. That means for most of you watching this video, this is as bad as it has ever been in your adult investing life. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is the first half of the year is over. And there are some things to pay attention to as we move forward and we look at the rest of the year. Now, these things are kind of brutal and sometimes a little scary. But the important thing to know is it's very important to realize that it's not timing the market, it's time in the market. As a matter of fact, studies show, because some of you may be feeling like, gosh, I just want to go to cash, I just want to get completely out. Let me sell everything and go to cash and run away. But guess what happens? People that do that, they tend to run into a problem because markets not only go down, but they go up. And they rebound quickly. And studies have shown if you just miss the best day of the market, looking back over a 30-year period of time here, if you just miss the best day of the market, right, one day you drop from 9.9 to 6.1. And if you miss the 3 best days in a recovery, you go from 9.9 down to 0.3 positive. And if you miss the 5 best days, you're going to end up in negative numbers. So trying to go all in and all out and missing these recovery moments is really dangerous for your portfolio. So the important thing to recognize is pay attention to it is really time in the market and not timing the market. The other thing for you to know is that basically if we go back to the real dark days of 2009, the S&P 500 dropped 50%. Now it's down a little bit. We had a bear market, so it's down around 20%. So it dropped twice of what it's dropped now. And in about 33 months, it had recovered. So the important thing to recognize, what we're going through right now is not near as bad as the structural banking collapse that we had in 2009. The market hasn't gone down even half as much. And even then, things recovered in a reasonable period of time. Now let's talk about the key things about a market recovery, what to pay attention to. Well, there's really 4 things going on. 4 things going on that are really driving stuff. First of all, this is a sentiment-driven issue. And so we have to look at the invasion, we have to look at inflation, we have to look at interest rates, and then we've got an election coming up. Those are the 4 big things that are going to pivot around what's going on in the market. The big issue more than anything else actually is inflation. Why? Because that's causing the Fed to raise interest rates, and that's what's got everybody a little bit spooked. Now, the question is always, well, when is it going to get better? Well, let me talk about that. You see, we've got invasion, inflation, interest rates, and election, and there's a cure for each one of those. You have the possibility of peace going on in the Ukraine. You have inflation, and we're looking for the moment when inflation peaks. Remember, the news does not have to be good. It just has to be less bad for the markets to begin to turn around. So we're looking for a moment when we can say inflation has peaked. The next thing you want to think about is when does the Fed talk about pausing, right? We're going through an interest rate rising cycle. That's something that a lot of people today aren't necessarily familiar with. You've had a long period of time where interest rates were either falling or almost nothing. Now they're rising. So it's new territory for a lot of folks. But here's the thing. Cycles end. We're in the beginning of a tightening cycle, an interest raising cycle, but there's a moment where they've done enough. And that's what we want to look for, a pause. Why is the Federal Reserve rising interest rates? They're raising interest rates because they want to slow the economy down. They're raising interest rates because the economy is doing too good, not too bad. That's a very important distinction. It's a very important distinction. The economy is doing too good, and that's causing inflation, and that's why they want to slow it down. And then the last one is the election. The election comes in November 8th, no matter what happens to any of these other things. And the reason why the election is important is there's some concerns, right? You wonder if you have divided government. Well, actually, markets tend to do pretty well in divided government. So if the Republicans take over the House of Representatives, there's a thought that two things. One, you have divided government. Markets tend to do well because kind of like not that much harm can be done by Congress. And also, if you do have divided, you won't see another great big stimulus package coming through from the administration. And over stimulus is what's caused this in the first place. So those are the things to pay attention to. Now, let's talk about the war, the invasion. Russia invaded Ukraine, and it has been brutal. Now, the good news was Ukraine was able to push back. Ukraine was able to push back Russia and keep them from taking Kyiv. But now what's going on is Russia is using their long-range artillery, and they're just grinding these cities into rubble. It's that attitude about we destroyed the village to save it. But the issue here is what's going to happen over the next 6 or 9 months. We're reaching this moment where it's conventional warfare, and you have to get to a question of, is either side able to execute large combined arms warfare to really change the tide of this? If you look at a map today, you can recognize that Russia has actually, they were pushed back from Kyiv up here. They've been pushed back from Kharkiv. This blue is the Ukrainians. So they're still going through, trying to take through this area. This is one of their objectives, right? Ukraine is fighting valiantly to hold them off. They're finally getting some long-range artillery, which will make a big difference, right? And they're beginning to have some success in pushing back in this area. Why is this important? Ukraine is part of the world's breadbasket. They grow a lot of wheat, a lot of other crops, and while Russia was trying to really box them in and not let anything get out through the ports, it looks like we've been successful so that Ukrainian wheat crops can go through Odessa and get out through the Black Sea. So what's changed in the last month or two, Snake Island, which sits right here, the Russians have abandoned it, so that's going to let Ukraine ship crops to the rest of the world out of Odessa. That's very, very important. So I can't tell you when this is going to end or exactly how it's going to end. You know, Ukraine says they don't want to cede any territory. You look at the map, chances are there's going to be a peace deal at some point that there may be some territory ceded. But regardless of that, the important thing is twofold. A, it looks like Ukraine is going to be able to export their wheat crop, which is very, very significant for world commodity prices because those were spiking up on the idea that they wouldn't be able to do that. So this helps tame some inflation. The next thing is that you have the ability for, at some point, there's going to be a moment where they're going to be able to talk about a ceasefire. And that's very, very important going forward. And the NATO has expanded dramatically, okay? And you've got Sweden and Finland have joined. And those countries are all increasing their defense budgets. So that's the part of the invasion. We can come back to that later, but what I really want you to understand is that this situation, part of what was spiking global commodity prices was the idea that Ukraine would be completely cut off. That doesn't seem to be in the cards anymore, so that's settling down some things going forward in the future. That helps the inflation picture, even though this war is an absolute horrible thing, and the world is going to have to find resolution of that. And we think that we're going to move towards that somewhere between now and the end of the year. What's the next big thing? All of this is feeding into inflation. Now, here's the thing. Most of the expectations are now we have pretty high inflation here in 2022, but then it begins to fall back down. Okay, and these estimates are changing, right? A little higher here, a little higher here, but we're thinking long term that inflation does go back down. The thing that's really got people worried is Michigan sentiment, because this is inflation expectations, right? So basically, this is what most people expected over the next 5 or 10 years. This is what people are expecting over the next year. So expectations of inflation over the next year or two are highly elevated right now. And that's kind of what's spooking things. Now, that's kind of the bad news. Let me talk about the good news. The good news, or at least the news that's not quite as bad as it has been, is gravity exists. What I mean by that is we've reached that moment where somewhere in here, I don't know exactly where, I don't know the exact number, but somewhere, right, in this June, July, August period of time, we're going to reach a moment where inflation may be peaking. And remember, that's an important word, because what happens when it peaks? It starts going down the other way, and that's a positive moment. So think of it as a basketball. You throw a basketball, it bounces up, it hits an apex, and then it comes back down. Why? Because of gravity. Well, you can think of inflation a little bit like that too. We're reaching a moment where inflation really spiked, but maybe we're close to that apex, and gravity begins to take hold. What I mean by that is, take a look at this. We were peaking, and then we dropped in April and May with the annual PCE price index. Okay, so that's kind of leveled off here. We're just now beginning to see the data for June, right? We're not going to see June data until we get deeper into July. So we have to pay attention to this. And we saw monthly PCE price headlines that spiked up, then it went down, then it went back up. So this is what was causing some volatility in the market, because it's really all about expectations of what the Fed's going to do. So when we look now at annual producer price index, you're beginning to see a slight fall in that. This is significant. I can't say, yay, it's getting better, but we can say, well, maybe it's not getting any worse. And that begins to be significant. We're going to know a lot. We're going to know a lot, and remember this date, around July 13th, okay, 13 days from now, right? That's when we're going to hear about the annual consumer price index, okay, the CPI number, which includes, like, what people are spending money on, and it's food, energy, all of these things. It's going to be a little volatile, but we need to figure out, has that begun to peak in June, or is it a real hot number and we're still going up, or are we leveling off, right? So July 13th is going to be a very key number. So pay attention to that, because the reaction to that will probably be a market mover. That's an important thing to pay attention to. All right. Now, let's move on. What's the other part of inflation? We talked about inflation being created by all this excess stimulus, this post-COVID situation where we stimulated the economy so much. That also led to supply chain problems. This is a proxy kind of for the supply chain. Remember, these are ships stacked up at the LA Long Beach Harbor, where most of, or 40% of all the stuff coming out of China comes in, a lot of shipping. And you see that we had a peak and now it's settling back down, right? We still have a lot of ships on hold, but we're getting a little bit better back to normal. So we're beginning to see the supply chain disruptions settle down a little bit. There's another thing that's significant. While in total we have a lot of excess savings, most of the excess savings that were being carried on by people at the bottom of the income structure, okay, have begun to dissipate, right? They're no longer getting all this extra stimulus. They save some of it, now they're spending it, and this is part of the issue, right? So we've had a worker shortage in this country, which has driven up wages because people basically, not everybody went back to work. Now the point of the matter is people's savings are running out, okay? And now they're going to need to go back to work, and you're going to see additional people coming into the labor force. And this is an important part. So remember, the Fed is raising interest rates because they want to slow down the economy. So when you begin to hear the economy is slowing, that's sort of bad news is good news, right? The bad news is good news. They want this reaction, and the sooner they get the reaction, the sooner inflation comes out, the sooner they stop raising interest rates, and that'll be a positive move for the market. This is how these relationships work. So consequently, you're beginning to see that markets are expecting, several large rises, right, at various meetings. So we look like we're probably going to get 75 basis points in July. We don't know about September, right? And then they could be 75, it could be 50, it could be 25, and then they're smaller as they go through. The September meeting is exceedingly important. So the dates I'm giving you to pay attention to, July 13th is the CPI data. And then talking about the September Fed meeting. Is it 75 basis points? Is it 50 basis points? If it's 25 basis points. If it's not 75, that means they're beginning to slow down the rate of increase of interest rates. That's talking about that key word that I mentioned before, the pause. They're beginning to pause. And that will be positive for the markets. Let's talk more about this inflation number. How does it affect us? You've seen these slides before if you've been watching my series, right? Basically, by the embargoes on Russia and everything, we've pulled 3 million barrels a day out of 100 million barrel a day production the global produces and we consume. And so what happened is, how do we replace that? Now, this is a slide from back in January where we had the capacity. Where were we going to get the 3 million barrels a day that Russia had that we've embargoed? And the issue was Saudi Arabia and UAE, which had the best capacity to help, they weren't going to play with us. Why? Because the administration was making friends with Iran. And Iran and Saudi Arabia are at war. And I think that's what happened, and this is a positive thing. I think the administration has finally decided that Iran is not going to be our friend no matter what we do. And they finally realized that. Therefore, they're back to talking to Saudi Arabia and UAE. And Saudi Arabia and UAE have the ability to put more oil into the market. That's very significant because we still have to figure out how do we make up these 3 million barrels a day. The other way we make up the 3 million barrels a day is here in the United States, right? You have to remember, we're the largest energy producer in the world. If you take all our oil and all our natural gas, the United States is the largest energy producer in the world. Have been for a while. You know, and so what we did, though, is we started cutting back on drilling and exploration, and that's created a little bit of problem for us. But now, as you can see very quickly, we're actually bringing online the number of wells that are drilled but not completed, and we're increasing drilling. So we've begun to increase U.S. domestic production. That's significant. Indeed, you can see it right here. This is weekly here so far this year. You can see we are increasing oil production. That makes a difference, right? We've increased over 300 barrels a day, and we're continuing to do that rapidly. That's going to help keep the global price of oil down. If you remember us talking about this a couple of videos ago, we were very worried about, we said, boy, oil over 125 a barrel could be recessionary in the United States. And that was something to pay attention to. And people were talking about oil prices spiking to 125, 150, 175, all these crazy numbers. And the point of it, it looks like that risk is gradually coming off the table. One, because we've been able to have changes in domestic policy, foreign policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, and domestic policy vis-a-vis local production. That's important. It's not a panacea, though, because when we look at gas prices, which affects the American consumer the most, oil prices affect global, right? And we see that and we track it, but gasoline is what affects us. The problem is that we're running out of refinery capacity. The United States has not built a new refinery since 1977. And we've got a million fewer barrel a day capacity of refineries since COVID. So that is creating some problems. That's one reason why gas prices have spiked so much. Let's talk about gas prices. Here it is. It's an ugly chart, right? It is an ugly chart. Everybody's paying tremendously more money for gas than they did before. And this is the other part that's affecting the economy, right? Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to slow the economy down, but what's going up even faster is gasoline. So instead of paying the banks, you're paying the oil companies. The point is that's taking money that you're not spending on anything else. It's slowing the economy down. That's the thing the Fed wants. Now let's talk about some adjustments in here. Where are we compared to last time? Well, if we adjust for inflation, we look at real prices, you can see we're getting right back up to this moment that you see demand destruction. These are moments of demand destruction where people are going like, I'm just not going to do this anymore. So you're beginning to see we're reaching those behavioral changes in gas prices and also oil prices, same kind of thing. So we're beginning to find this moment we're beginning to find this moment. It's very important that we have to recognize behavior is going to change. The big question that you have to see, is when are we going to see a pause in the Fed's interest rate hiking cycle? When does the pause occur? Now, there's a lot of expectations around that, right? What this means here is we've got a meeting. We got a meeting on 7/27, and the thought is they're going to raise 75 basis points. Then the question is, most people are thinking about this next meeting on 9/21. Okay, maybe they raise it 50 basis points. We don't know. This is why this data that I'm talking about in July and August and September is so important. This is the meeting to pay attention to. We're probably going to get 75 here, but this in September is going to tell us whether we're beginning to get the pause in the hiking cycle. That's why that's important. Because if we're at 75 basis point increase and they take it down to 50, that's the signal that the Fed thinks they've kind of done as much as they need to do, or they're getting to that moment. And indeed, when you look at expectations, right? Expectations for the terminal, those are beginning to come down. We have said numerous times on multiple videos that behavior is different now than it has been in the past, and the Federal Reserve is going to get the reaction from the economy and the consumer at lower rates than they expect. Now, what does that mean? That increases the likelihood of the Fed overshooting, okay? And they could raise it too much too fast, and if that's the case, then they're going to have to untangle it like they did in 2019. Or they also put the likelihood of recession on the table. These things are real and we have to consider it. But if behavior is changing now, and you can see it, the economy is slowing down. Things are slowing down dramatically, right? And that's beginning to happen. So the Federal Reserve is getting the reaction that they want in the markets at lower rates than they probably expected. This is something important to watch. We're going to be watching these trends very, very carefully, right? Now, moving on. This is what happens to the market, right? What's the expected path? For a while, we were thinking it was going to go up to 3.72 on the Fed funds rate, and you saw how the market really reacted to that, right? So this is the S&P versus expectations of what's going to happen with the federal funds rate. You can kind of see how those match, right? And so now these things are beginning to change. Well, if that happens, you can begin to see the S&P react accordingly. This is why I say that term pause is so important. Somewhere in here is where the Fed is going to find the terminal rate or the neutral rate, and they'll stop raising and then they'll back it back down. And that's when the market begins to recover. So it's important to pay attention to this stuff. It's really all about time. Now, a couple of big questions everybody wants. No recession, little recession, big recession. I think we're in this moment where we have to say we may find ourselves in no recession if we end up, things slow down fast enough now that the Fed slows down somewhere this year, and we probably have kind of a light, softer landing. Now, that's the possibility that we look for, and we don't have a recession then in 2023. What is probably more likely, like I said before, the Fed's going to overshoot a little bit. We'll probably have a little R, a little recession. It'll be a technical recession. You may or may not feel it a lot, but it will meet those criteria of 2 negative quarters of GDP growth, or basically the National Economic Bureau kind of telling us what that is. But the important thing is the likelihood is you're either no recession or maybe a shallow one that goes for a little while. I do not think a big recession is in the cards for a couple of reasons. First of all, and this is also the reason why it could be no recession or slight recession. What happens in a recession? Large amounts of unemployment, right? That's the thing you really worry about, large unemployment. Well, here's the deal. Right now, we've got 2 jobs for every person looking. 2 jobs for every person looking. So we could actually have a technical recession that pulls 5 million jobs out of the market, which would, under normal circumstances, would take our unemployment rate from 3% to 6 or 7%, right? Now you pull 5 million jobs out, nothing happens. You're still at full employment. It's a very important distinction. So it's very hard to have a recession. I don't say impossible. It's very hard to have a recession when you've got this strong of a labor market. Indeed, we're back to almost an all-time high, right? This was the peak, 152 million and a half people working. We're almost back there. We go 3 or 4 months at current growth rates, we're going to find ourselves back at an all-time high. More people working than ever before. Very hard to have a recession when that's the case, right? And so this is why I feel pretty confident that things are not going to be as bad as some people are saying. And the other thing is more people are making more money than ever before. Real wages and salaries are already at an all-time high. So that the people that have jobs are making more money than they were before. Now, inflation is eating up some of that. That's very, very true. That's why we use this chart on real wages and salaries adjusted for inflation. So, big R, little r, no R. We're kind of in the camp that there's either no recession or it's a little recession, right? Not a big one. Because I think we'll be able to recognize it and see it. Fed will begin to change policy. You're already seeing some of the supply chain things get better and some of the inflation pressures beginning to subside. How does all this affect the most important thing with regards to the price of stocks inside your portfolio? Earnings. Now it's the 1st of July. We're going to start here in a couple of weeks seeing earnings. Earnings are probably going to be pretty good. Here's what you could probably expect. Earnings will be okay, but expectations may be ugly, right? And that's going to create volatility in the market. They'll say, yeah, we had decent earnings in the first half of the year, right? That's positive, but we're very uncertain, or our expectations are lower for the second half of the year. One, because there's uncertainty in the market. We don't know what the Fed's going to do. We don't know yet, right now, if we've already hit peak inflation. So what you have to prepare yourself for, is the month of July and the month of August are still going to be very, very bumpy, right? Unless we get a big, clear turn on some of these 4 things I've talked about, you're in for a couple of rough months. It doesn't mean they're horrible. It means they're uncomfortable. And that's the expectation. What does that do? Well, if you have portfolios and you're sitting on 10, 15, 20, 25% cash, you have some moments as the market's moving, you can kind of maybe take advantage of that volatility and put some of that money to work. Because out a little bit farther, if we're right about a small R or a no R, you're going to see a recovery that's going to make it feel like you got some bargains here if you bought. But it's going to be a couple of tough months. And we have to really be careful about that and pay close attention to it. The big thing here is time. The world spins around 1,000 miles an hour, right? You can't stop it. But every day moving forward throughout the rest of this year, we have a pretty good likelihood that things will start getting better, not necessarily getting worse. I can't tell you when it's exactly going to turn around. Nobody rings a bell, right? Nobody has a perfect crystal ball. But it's reasonable to say that some of the key catalysts we can identify. Pay attention to the July CPI read on the 13th of July. If that's really, really high, then that means we're in for probably, a little bit longer period of time of pain. If that's beginning to come lower, right, or not as high, or we can say, boy, we're probably at that moment where gravity is going to take over, then that means that things probably start getting better closer towards the end of the year. And then pay very close attention to the September Fed meeting, right? Is it 75? Is it 50? Is it 25? Again, all of this comes down to paying attention to these things. And we've got 60 to 90 days before we have clarity on them. The only date that's for sure is the election. That's roughly 120 days from now. But we've got 60 to 90 days before we get clarity on some of these. So again, I can't tell you exactly when everything's going to turn around. I can tell you that probably after having the worst first half of the year since 1970, that the second half of the year is probably going to be better than the first half, right? I can tell you that the time clock is moving towards some things getting better, and the data is beginning to say that probably somewhere in the, whether it happened last month or next month or this month, we probably have hit this peak inflation moment, and things will begin to settle down. So the important thing to pay attention to, listen, and look for a major change between now and the end of the year in the Ukraine. That will drive inflation expectations. Inflation hitting a peak, that will begin to drive both inflation expectations and Fed policy expectations. The Fed beginning to go, yeah, we probably have stopped this tightening cycle, or we're going to slow it down or pause it. Let's see how things go. And then you have the election. That's November 8th. That's the only date we know, folks. But I think between now and then, let's be prepared for it to be a little rough, but know that over time, these things get better. I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that it's given you some perspective. Everybody should have a great 4th of July weekend, and everybody should look forward to a pretty decent summer. Markets are going to be a little rough, so you might as well go swimming. Take care. Thank you. 3, 2, 1.
Okay.